So yeah, welcome everybody. Thank you all for introducing yourselves. So again, this is the Causality Reading Group, co-hosted with the CSCSC community and Orbital Studies magazine. And we're doing this very transdisciplinary look at the mysterious question of causality and seeing how different fields and different traditions are engaging with it. This week, we have Zach Schlosser presenting the paper. So Zach's a friend of mine who's uh, a very like wide-ranging thinker in a lot of interesting ways, and is also very active in cultivating new cultures of science education and inquiry. And so he's the education director at the Divinity School, which is an organization trying to help shift scientific cultures towards a more life-fulfilling, life-oriented culture, which I'm sure he can speak about a little bit. But he's also involved with many, many projects. It has just sort of again a wide-ranging curiosity about the world and consciousness and all kinds of things. And so it's an honor and a privilege to have him here to introduce this paper. And so with that, I'll hand it over to Zach.
Great. Thanks, Xavier. I've been really enjoying the reading group so far and meeting all of you. And it's a pleasure and an honor to be presenting this week's paper. Just want to say one thing about the Divinity School. It's an R&D institute trying to make progress on creating two new fields. One is horizons of biological intelligence, and one is naturalizing machine agency. And I'll put a link. You can read more about it. I won't go too deeply into it. But our motivation is essentially that uh, various sciences in various life and mind sciences are kind of blocked by old metaphysics and old paradigms. And technology is rushing ahead. And if it's possible that we make the mistake of building our world to be too simple, simpler than what's good for us, but the right level of simplicity to be good for machines. We're trying to avoid that outcome by continuing to encourage research on the depth of biological organisms and their intelligence, and by uh, encouraging research and design on machine systems such that they don't denude the depth of biological and ecological contexts and users, but instead deepen them. And so I'm going to put a link in to one of our major activities this year, which is to publish a 2-volume anthology, 1 volume on each of those fields. And it's very field building, and we're open for submissions for people who want to propose chapters for the anthologies, really to outline research programs, pragmatic and visionary research programs that would contribute to the fields. If you have more questions about it, I'd love to talk to you, and I would love to receive proposals from all of you.
Maybe you can share your email or something, how we can get in touch.
Yeah. And Xavier is an advisor to some of those efforts, and looking forward to working more deeply with him and with orbital studies, and potentially with CSCS and Pavel. So moving into the paper. So I have been wanting to read Tyler's work for a few years now, but haven't. And so this was a great opportunity, an excuse for me to bring it forward. I'm motivated by the larger context of the project around this paper. So I wanted to start the presentation by giving more of that context, because it's quite significant. It's quite long term. It's very well resourced, and it's already having global policy impacts, and it's primed to have even larger policy impacts going forward, and potentially, integrations with predictive AI, real world predictive systems, which I appreciate, Lauren, your skepticism, and I think the models for real world prediction it's confusing about their current status, but uh, but they could continue to advance quickly. So I'll start with some context, then we'll get into the paper. Can you all see the slideshow?
Yep, looks good.
Okay. Constructed measures and causal inference towards a new model of measurement for psychosocial constructs by Tyler VanderWeele. So the Human Flourishing Program was founded in 2006 at Harvard's Institute for Quantitative Social Science. It's a partnership between Harvard and Baylor University. Um, and their mission includes understanding the nature, distribution, and determinants of a flourishing life and achieving measurable impact by working with key institutions, including governments, companies, religious communities, to develop a robust definition and measurement infrastructure for flourishing. And the long-term vision explicitly includes establishing flourishing as the default lens for policymakers and institutional leaders worldwide. The Global Flourishing Study has been established since 2016. 2016 to 2021 was kind of preliminary concept building theoretical work. In 2021, they launched large scale data collection. And in 2025, they released the first major wave of results. They published 30 papers and including analyzing data from 22 countries and over 200,000 participants, and they were originally funded with $43 million. Just a couple insights from this first wave of data, large-scale data. Young adults showed consistently lower flourishing scores across many countries compared to older age groups. Religious service attendance showed strong positive associations with flourishing across nearly all countries studied. And Indonesia reported the highest levels of well-being across indicators, while Japan reported the lowest. So 30 papers. I haven't read them. There's a lot to get into in terms of the results. Their indices, there's only 6 indices. They're pretty straightforward. So I was surprised when I noticed how simple the presentation of what flourishing is from their perspective. But yeah, there's a lot that you could dive into if you wanted to learn more. So I was interested, again, going back to this AI thing, I'm interested in this kind of psychohistory future, whether or not it's possible, and what are the risks and opportunities of using AI for real world impacts prediction, especially as it applies to policy design and implementation. So I did a little bit of review on that for mental health, because that's the closest thing to what we're talking about, what they're working on in terms of flourishing. And 2024 systematic literature review found that machine learning techniques demonstrate the potential to enhance early detection, diagnostic precision, and personalized treatment strategies for mental health conditions. And this is a quote from the second paper: the presentations and course of psychiatric illness is influenced by the interactions between biological, psychological, and social factors. This can pose a significant challenge for AI models that are primarily designed for single task applications. So I didn't get a sense that like, deep learning models are providing major insights for diagnosis or treatment, treatment choice for mental health right now. So it seems relatively nascent. I've seen conflicting reports about AI's ability to outpredict forecasters on forecasting platforms like Metaculus and Kalshi. So I'm unclear about what the state of the field is. So now let's get into the paper. So the paper has, I think, three big sections. One section is um, uh, current models. So current models of um, analyzing the correlations, at least, between various psychological factors and some claim that you want to make about that and about relevant treatments. Uh, and then showing how there's a ton of assumptions, especially about causality, that are baked into these standard models that are not justified by um, the standard analyses. And then a third section where he basically um, unpacks the kind of the three ways in which reality is much more complex than models. Uh, Basically, three ways you could, I would say, three ways you could infinitely unpack fractally the fractally infinite depth of complexity of any model. He doesn't frame it that way. He frames it as like these are uh, bounded issues um, in model design that can be addressed. But I took it as these are infinite challenges to always be aware of and to make progress on. So maybe that's something we can talk about in the discussion. So um, uh, is a quote. The model that dominates classical approaches to measurement and scale development, sometimes referred to as a reflective model, typically presupposes an underlying univariate latent variable that gives rise to measured indicators assumed to have causal efficacy. That statement kind of encapsulates the whole paper, which is why I led with it. It's true of both the reflective model and the formative model, and he's he's going to claim that the assumption that there is a univariate latent variable is usually unjustified, and the claim that any of the um, indices that are measured or the supposed latent variable that is claimed um, that those have causal impact, some sort of causal relationship with the outcome that you're concerned with, that's also an unjustified assumption. But he is interested in causal claims and thinks that scientists can do a better job of um, designing experiments to be able to make justified causal claims.
So here we're talking about something like flourishing or happiness as this univariate variable that then causes the survey measured sort of things, or what?
Yeah, so flourishing, I think that they would. I think I'm. This is totally an assumption, but I think that he would, in his own work, because he doesn't use it as an example in this, flourishing would be. It would be more like the formative model, where flourishing is the latent variable that
Mhm.
well, actually, no, flourishing is the outcome that he cares about. And so I don't actually know if in his work they define latent variables. There's six um, indices that they're measuring in their own work.
I mean, can you go back to this statement? I guess I'm just trying to understand basically, right, that this is saying that the research says that, okay, there's some latent thing such as flourishing or happiness or well-being or whatever, right, that is kind of defining this person, right, on a scale of 0 to 100. And the things that we are like, we can't measure it directly, so we're asking them surveys with all kinds of questions, and we're assuming that this latent variable and the number that I, let's say, have it, like there's a ground truth that my happiness level is 76, right? And that will have a causal effect on all the questions that I answer in the survey, right? So there's the one variable that controls my answers to the survey, and we're trying to infer that from the tools we use to measure, right? Is that what
So
this?
yeah, so my understanding is that flourishing is more like why.
Okay.
Um, uh, let's go. Did I skip?
Okay, yeah, if I
So
was, maybe I
yeah,
need to
so
wait. Sorry.
flourishing. This is getting confusing already, but flourishing, I think, is more like why. It's more like the outcome that you're trying to assess some impact on through an intervention. Um, the intervention, the intervention or the exposure is A, I think, and the the x's are and the latent variable is eta, and the indices are the x's. Um, and so there's a question about in the reflective model, the latent variable has um, these indices that capture components of it, essentially. Um, in the formative model, the indicators combine together to form the underlying variable of interest. So the latent variable would be if it was true that there was a univariate latent variable with regards to flourishing, I think what he's saying is that people would make the default claim that people would make is that you can have some kind of intervention that changes this latent variable, this single latent variable, and it'll have a causal influence uh, on flourishing, on why.
Yeah, and Pavel, the sense I was getting just about when he's giving these examples, he's not talking just. I think he's going to use it for flourishing, but I think the example he's talking about just how where people use reflective and formative models and psychometrics kind of generally, right? So he gives, intelligence as the paradigmatic example of the reflective model, where in psychometrics, and I think he's contesting this, but in psychometrics, they'll sometimes talk about like an underlying G factor intelligence that you then do a bunch of tests on, and then you compute something you might call IQ, and then you might say from that that it's then causal to like life outcomes in some way, and that would be the paradigmatic reflective model, and the paradigmatic formative model he's giving as this social integration index or something. So something where you're like, hey, we could have an index to measure to what extent somebody's socially integrated by checking if they have friends and checking if they like have a family and go to school and yada yada. And all of those things are what we actually observe, and that leads to. So I think he's giving these not in this paper. I didn't see him too much applying it directly to flourishing. It was my sense. Yeah.
Thanks. Yeah.
Jeff, did you want to ask a question now?
Yeah,
I'm
and
happy
it
to want to jump in.
where would so these indices X, they're like the observed. So if you had something like age, where would age go? We just ask people and they write down their age and it's observed and there's no
Yep.
ambiguity. Okay.
Yep. So yeah, so the I think Xavier, you just did a great job of expressing the reflective model and the formative models with those paradigmatic examples. So reflective model, again, we think the normal way of describing this would be that there's some underlying variable that matters, and that there's a bunch of things that you can measure that come out of that. The formative model is that there are a bunch of things that you can measure that all contribute to the underlying variable that matters that you might want to impact to change an outcome. Yeah, so again, coming back to the big picture here. However, this analysis of reflective and formative models assumed that the latent eta was causally efficacious. This may not be the case. neither in figures 2a and 3a nor in equations 2 and 3 require that it is eta rather than the indicators that is causally efficacious. So that's what he's expressing in these diagrams, where the red arrow is expressing causal efficacy. He's just taking different hypotheses for where causal efficacy is coming from in any model of some complex real world dynamic or psychological outcome that you're trying to measure. And he's saying the latent variable could be causally efficacious. That's true in both the formative and the reflective versions of that. So he calls this the structured formative, or the structured reflective and the structured formative diagrams. And then in this case, that the causality could be coming, the causal arrows could be coming from the indices, not from a latent variable, even if there was one. And that the analysis that you do, the kind of like the actual math that you do, doesn't actually distinguish between either of these conditions. It doesn't, the math is the same. The results you get will be the same under either of these assumptions about where the, what's causally efficacious. So he says that's a problem, and we shouldn't be telling stories about where causality is in the model. The assumption of a univariate causally relevant latent variable is strong and will often not correspond to reality. Factor analysis may be useful in generating hypotheses about underlying causally efficacious univariate latent variables, but does nothing to establish this. The assumption of an underlying univariate structural factor is often just presumed, not tested. Associations between different indicators and outcomes are rarely examined. The presumption of a univariate structural latent variable may also well be unrealistic in numerous other settings. So, Uval, you were mentioning that you were hoping that this paper, might be relevant for the social science research that you're starting to do. I think, the point that he's making in this paper is that this claim is not normal. At this point, he's made that the whole social science field in general is making this mistake, so this isn't.
Yeah.
This
Can I
this
just
work is
something
not
quick about that?
Yeah.
I am not sure if we are making that assumption at all. And I wish Chris was here to let me know if that's true. But there are many variables that are considered in upbringing that could be causally efficacious.
We've lost you, Yuval. I'm not sure if your audio's cut out. Oh, I think you dropped off the call.
Okay. Well, if he comes back on, we'll go back to him. Okay, so that's the kind of state of the field from his perspective.
I lost you guys.
We can hear
you
you
hear
now.
me?
Yep.
Yeah. Anyway, I'm just not sure we're making any of these assumptions on any of our variables. There's nothing univariate. There is simplifications that come out of factor analysis or cluster analysis. But the left-right variable is only one out of several that seem to be important in political opinions. So I don't know if this assumption of a univariate latent of just one latent variable being causally efficacious is being made by us. Anyway, go on.
Yeah, that's great. I think he's holding up two warnings. So one is about assuming there's an univariate latent variable, and the second is assuming that your analysis is giving you insight into what the causal relationships are. So that's another thing to consider in
Okay.
your work.
Okay.
Okay. So that was his presentation of the state of the field, and now he's going to get into more complex models. He's going to problematize all this. He's going to show why it's problematic. So I because I have some study of like Buddhist philosophy, I was thinking about this as kind of like space-like and time-like, and then like concept-like critiques here. So this first one is space-like. So he's saying any any this is a kind of formative structure here. Or this is a reflective structure here with the latent variables kind of giving rise to indicators. But he's saying there could be many. There's no reason why there's a single latent variable under a single indicator. There could be many latent variables under a single indicator. In fact, we should assume that that's the case. Anything you look at, if you look at more deeply, you're going to find that it's made of many things. And so if you're trying to control for if you're trying to control for confounders, you have to keep looking at the underlying diversity of the of whatever you think the thing that you're measuring is. It's not one thing; it's many things. And it might be that one of those many things is causally relevant to the outcome you care about, but you won't know that unless you look more deeply and discover the diversity underlying what you thought was just a single entity. And then this is the time-like critique that he's making. So he's saying that you don't know what moment of a thing is causally efficacious for the outcome. It could be, and you have to and the moment before the thing that you're measuring might be causally might be also a confounder because it might be causally impactful to the moment of measurement and then also directly causally impactful to the final outcome. So he's saying not only do you have to look at what your indicators or your latent variables are made out of, you also have to look at how they change over time and control for changes to them over time and possible causal confounders over time. And then this third kind of even deeper critique that he's offering is that this complex reality, there is some reality, it is complex, and the only way that we really come to create a model of latent variables and indicators is through the generation of concepts that we then formalize into constructs. But that these have some, and he's not putting, I was a little bit surprised that he didn't put he didn't make this arrow from concepts to latent variables and from concepts to indicators. He didn't make that a red causal arrow, but he is basically making that claim is that changes in our concepts and in our constructs change what we are able to notice and what we're able to measure and the stories we tell about the relationship between variables and outcomes. And that if we change our concepts and constructs, then we will change what we notice and what we measure in the story that we tell. So he wants people to be aware that that's the case and to try to to also recognize that they need to control for concepts and constructs by having formal definitions of those, of the terms that they're using, and not assume that they can just kind of bottom up, that it's not sufficient to generate an understanding of a term from the bottom up empirically by noticing what the data says. You actually have to have a formal definition in order to clarify if you're measuring the right thing and to compare your work to other people's work and make sure that you're both measuring the same thing. So his conclusions are two, we need a clear distinction between concepts and constructs, their underlying reference, and our attempts to measure these underlying reference. And we need clear definitions of the construct. Proposed items should then be derived from the definitions with an understanding of their relationship. He did in the paper, and this is maybe something we try to get into in the discussion. He did in the paper outline some ways that you could actually test for causal relationships in order to make more justified claims about them. It was only a couple lines, and I didn't understand it fully, which is why I didn't include it in the presentation. And he does think that that's worth doing. But the paper was mostly a critique and a kind of sketch of what you need to take into account if you want to have a more robust explanatory model and a model of an intervention that leads to an impact that you want. But that was just a sketch. He's like, you need to be aware of that anything that you measure, if you look more closely, there's going to be multiple things there, not just one. You need to be aware that anything you measure, when you're considering, if you look, it'll change over time, and that matters, and you want to be clear about what thing you're measuring at what time. And he wants us to be aware that the way that we're thinking about things and defining things, either implicitly or explicitly, is going to matter for what we can for what we notice and what we can measure in the story that we tell. So that's that.
Great presentation, Zach. Thank you. Maybe I'll just invite us all to just take a moment. We just received a bunch of fun, heady concepts. Take a breath. Collect your thoughts. And I'll invite us to move into discussion. And so, as always in the discussion, like we may end up with, little sidebars, but it's okay to just place a provocation in that doesn't necessarily get resolved. Where I think part of being a larger group looking at this paper is that we'll get a flavor for the different ways it's landing in different bodies from different histories of experience. And I think that expands all of our ability to understand the various ways this paper can be understood. And so, listen with an open mind and an open heart. And I invite you to jump in when you feel called.
I'm curious how much solutions he presents. I mean, he presents problems, sure, and to me, it's like these problems are, yeah, like I haven't thought of them so formally, but to some extent, it's like, yeah, sure, the causality is hard, right? And usually, the reason we can't do it very carefully is because, like, to do it to control for all the factors he's considering, we need an impossibly large amount of experimentation, data, counterfactual experiments, which are generally not available. So it's almost like given limited available data and experimentation and limited available funds, right? Is almost the question is what is the most efficient resource allocation, right? Like what exact experiments do you need to do if you can only do 10 of them, so to speak, right? And knowing that you will not be able to like factor out all confounders, all possible confounders, you will not be sure, and maybe your final result needs to have that certain level of humility and say like, okay, we're not sure what the cause is, but these are the chances that these are the causes, right? And we usually, by Occam's razor, assume that it's the simplest one until proven otherwise, right? So it's like, given all of that setup, it's almost like, how do we do research? Like, what's the actionable recommendation, right?
Yeah. One thing my sense was that he wants people to do better research, but also he'd be happy if they just made weaker claims. So like I'm going back to the text itself. I'm on page 145, and I'll read something. He says, this is the right-hand column, starting from the second to last paragraph. The application of such tests to prominent scales, such as the satisfaction with life scale, indicates that the structural interpretation, so the structural interpretation is the, making causal claims. Structural interpretation can be rejected. While there is evidence that 4 out of 5 indicators are associated with all-cause mortality, for one indicator, if I could live my life over, I would change almost nothing, there is effectively no such evidence. We should be wary of assuming that a structural factor model always holds. This does not imply the measure is bad, or that the basic univariate model is a bad fit for the covariance. The lack of a structural interpretation, furthermore, does not threaten the use of the scale as an outcome, provided those using the scale equally value the individual indicators as outcomes. It is reasonable to take their average. So that's like, Pavel, going back to your first question, he's saying you could actually treat the indicators X's as outcomes, the Y, if you're doing that on purpose, and if you acknowledge that you care about the indicators as goods in themselves, not just as either pointers to a causally significant variable for Y, or themselves as causally significant for Y. Considered in this way, this average might then effectively be viewed as an index. Similar comments likewise pertain to other measures taken as outcomes. The interpretation of constructed measures as outcomes is arguably easier than as exposures.
Jeff, unless you unmuted on purpose, I'm going to mute you. Okay, I've muted you, Jeff. You'll have to message me, I think, to unmute again. I'm not sure if that's how that works. Sorry about that.
I'm going to risk making a fool of myself, I think. It's okay. I do it quite often. So it seems to me, humbly, he's taken a lot of words to say something really simple. It's rubbish in, rubbish out. And that's an old problem. A lot of words. I mean, I struggled with it. I just used an AI, said, hey, what's his kind of key points here? Put it in layman terms for me. And it seemed, I mean, the AI didn't tell me this, but kind of what I've kind of, there's the measuring problem. What are we measuring? What parameters are we using? We've got the questions problem. What questions have we actually asked? And we've limited the field. I mean, it's almost laughably, ridiculously small amount of questions they've asked this people. I mean, we're so complex about how, just in this room, if I asked about your thriving and how you felt about it and how you felt in your world and asked you tomorrow, it'd probably be different. So I think it's such a vast field. And to describe what thriving is in how many questions, 6 or 7 questions. And then having done that, then there's all these assumptions on whether it actually caused it or not. So for example, somebody who goes to church, you might say, oh, it's good to be religious, but it might just be the person that goes to church is taking reflective time about their lives. And many people who are not going to church are not doing that. So it's just such a coarse and shallow questioning. And I think of someone like, I don't know if you're aware of Nora Bateson and Warm Data Labs, which are looking at kind of contextual discussions and what have you, or Dave Snowden's looking at narratives and what have you, and these trying to get these contextually rich kind of investigations into how people feel. And I do, just for me personally, something I'm getting super interested in, instead of looking at thriving. Okay, I'm going to talk about being a mum. So I raised 8 children accidentally. I ended up with children that weren't mine. I raised them or what have you. And something I realized was that when I was a new mum, I thought I was going to be this amazing mother. I was going to do all these great things for my kids. But actually what I realized was they have a great deal of emergence just within themselves. And actually, the most important thing I can do is prevent harm from me and others. So it wasn't that I needed to do the good, I needed to prevent the bad, because traumatizing a child, you can do a huge damage quite unintentionally. And some of my kids have come from very difficult backgrounds before they came to me. So they were fostered by me. So I almost think we kind of need to look at it upside down. Let's not look at thriving. Let's look at what prevents thriving. Let's look at some kind of base level. And that's actually quite simple. If someone beat you up yesterday, or if someone put you in prison, or if someone's hurting you or you're starving, these are not, we don't have to do a research study that says, oh my gosh, this hungry person is not thriving. So I'm just wondering, just from my personal simplistic kind of viewpoint, whether what you guys think to that.
Yeah, Lauren, hop in.
Yeah, so I would echo Jen's sentiment on this, in that what I'm really getting from the paper is going from a very formal place to kind of remind the purpose of some of these constructs and challenge the assumption of two things. One, the neutral observer of the performer of the study, and as by designing the study or the questions you're asking, you're also embedding conceptual granularity, going back to maybe the first meeting's conversation on what the scope is and how that affects the causality, but also this sense of absolutism in the models that we're building. So if you define a model and you claim that it's an absolute truth, there are so many other nuances. And I feel like this really, from a technical perspective, breaks down, why did you choose this causal graph? You could have chosen this one, you could have chosen this one, you could have chosen this one. But actually your choice of this one partly is to communicate a story, partly your decision to define your concepts in a certain way defines the univariate property in itself. So for example, if you have a multivariate system, but you define a new concept that contains these multiple variables as one definition, then maybe you can do a univariate study, but that is a choice that you're doing, and your observations are also influencing that causal point that you're making.
Yeah, one thing that comes to mind. So I think I agree with everything everybody said so far. And yeah, and Jen, to your point, I think I had a very similar feeling about this paper, because I spent, especially at the beginning, I was really trying to make sure I like carefully understood the like equations, making sure I was reading it properly. But he's almost starting you from a place where you're doing that. You could argue, I don't know exactly what his intentions are, but there's a rhetorical move that he might be making, or that he could be making, which is to take a certain kind of neurotype who's deep in this world and is like deep into playing around with these very complex, or as we say here, also very simple mathematical models to understand the world, kind of meeting them there, and then kind of ushering them back to a kind of humility, and so there's almost a path to it, or like, I'm always a little unsettled by developmental language, but I wonder, like, for a certain person, like for a certain PhD student who's in like year 4 and has really been like trying to learn this math, right? So they've been so immersed in really thinking about the models. And I speak from experience on this. I don't mean to like take down somebody else. There's a sense in which you've been really thinking about, you've had these moments of insight. Like, when you learn about how a latent variable model can be used to describe reality, you have this like, oh, that's a powerful way to think about things. Like when I observe notes in a song, I could think about what the underlying key is. And like that could be understood as a causal form that like makes certain notes show up and other ones not. And then I could like observe the notes and try to infer what the latence underlying is. It's a really empowering feeling thing to learn these models and learn these techniques and figure out where you can apply them. And so I can imagine a paper like this at a certain point in somebody's journey as just this reminder of like, yeah, you're flying high. This is really exciting. You've learned these things. You got 100 on that test. Like you've learned how to wield these tools. Now let's just remember for a moment. Let me take you from there back to this place of remembering where they come from, so you can maybe hold them with a bit more lightness or a bit more humility. And that might be the purpose it's really serving here, which I think is actually a really important one, because then I think you can have all these really bright, really highly trained people bring that humility to their work. I think about I've spent a certain amount of time in like tech organizations, and there's constantly this problem of like picking a metric that you can optimize towards, optimizing towards that metric, and needing some sort of a process by which you start to notice when that metric no longer has any connection with what you care about, right? Like how do you start to notice that you thought engagement would be a measure of product quality and it's become a measure of addiction, right? In order to even notice that that's changed and that you have to like maybe drop that measure and take on another one, you have to be able to do this move of remembering how you got here in the first place. And so, yeah, that's sort of, I wonder about whether that's the place that this serves in the culture. Akil, your hand's up.
I had the same reaction as Jen initially, and I'm like, 11 pages to say the map is not the territory. But now reflecting on what you said, Xavier, yeah, one would think that is obvious and doesn't need saying, but clearly it does, right? Like GDP as a measure of progress and prosperity, or like barometric optimization in organizations, and every single one of those people using those metrics would agree that the map is not the territory and still go ahead and do the same thing. And I'm sure I'm guilty of doing that plenty of times as well. Yeah, I have a similar question as Pavel. Like, how do you make something actionable out of this? Like, it's well and good that there are limitations over here, but there are real information problems. Maybe multiple metric indices for measuring any problem, or having anti-goals saying that improve reduce homelessness, but not by killing the homeless people. So like, have those kind of anti-goals. That might be something that is useful. Yeah. But yeah. Any other thoughts that come to people's mind on how to action this would be
Something I heard from someone that I don't know, I've been like thinking about good Goodhart's law for a long time, and someone mentioned I like the difference between measuring and pattern recognition. Right. So often when we have a metric and this univariate thing, it's a measurement sort of a thing. Right. Whereas pattern recognition, right? Like we as humans can very easily like look at a thing that says like a checkerboard on it and be like, there's a pattern there, or some other pattern, or right, like our brain is very good at recognizing patterns. Now AI neural networks can also like recognize where there's a pattern, but they're not measuring a specific thing at the same time, right? In the sense that they're choosing what to measure, right? Like if it's a checkerboard, first you identify, oh, there is a checkerboardness measure that I need to measure, and then I give it a number. It's like very checkerboardy, right? Or very wavy, or right. And so it's like there's this feedback loop that it's not like, this is the measure, this is the number. It's like, what should I measure? Maybe I should measure this. This is a number. Okay, the score is not very high. Maybe I should measure something else. Then this is the score. Okay, maybe I should change. Right. So there's this like constant feedback loop of what I measure, and then what's the value, and then refining what I measure and what's the value. And right. And to me that feels maybe like in the right direction, because it's like, how do we as humans identify what we value intuitively? Like we can't put a number on it, but somehow we can tell. So how do we go back to that, like reverse engineering our own intuitions?
Jen, I see your hands up again.
Yeah, sorry. What Pavel says is really interesting. It's almost to kind of shift into kind of spiritual speak. It's kind of the difference between prediction and kind of prophecy, where prophecy is talking about patterns of flow. If you do this, this might be the result, and it's very broad. Whereas prediction is trying to measure and be precise. And kind of when we were talking about causality and the granularity of causality, if you're looking at large groups of people and the flows of what they're doing, as opposed to individual choices and making, it's just such a complex flow. And I'm really, really thinking hard about that and about how people feel. It's just hard to see how measuring such subjective things is going to really give us workable material without keeping the story going. And it's not even about individuals, there's a sort of there is this granularity of society and tribes and families and all that sort of thing. So I'm kind of really trying to feel to something that's a lot deeper than what happens in academia. You end up doing things and data sets and what have you, and forget that the tools cast shadows. Every tool, every way of thinking. It's not that it's wrong in itself, but every tool, every metric will cast shadows behind which you won't see. So it's almost as if I like this idea of orbital, because that's the idea of kind of moving around things, looking at different views. So yeah, okay, well, maybe we will look at metrics, but maybe we'll also look at story. Maybe we'll look at just minimalisms and perhaps preventions, that rather than preventing harm, rather than trying to do good. So I'm just thinking, this kind of idea of and academia, and a lot of academics here. So because I'm a concept artist and I kind of work with what I make and what I think and what I write, I'm a little more willing to kind of state my opinions and ideas as something novel. But I think the academic way of inquiring about an issue has a huge shadow embedded in that style of thinking. It's got a linguistic shadow, jargonistic shadow. It's actually, no matter how hugely intelligent you are, just trying to translate between the different fields is very, very difficult. They're even using the same words to mean different things. So there's just all these shadows going on. And I think this is the beauty of what's happening with talking about complexity science and contemplation. It's just trying to expand our thinking and our field and our sharing. So, we're here in this room together and we're just getting all these lovely different views and responses. And I think this is where the warm data, the narrative style of thinking is just really, really rich and rewarding.
Jen, you're inspiring me. I want to pop out of the paper a little bit and say a little bit more about what I see him doing and the whole program is doing that I appreciate. Because I don't want to, I don't know, I feel like defending him or something a little bit in this call. So to me, I want a future where economics and policy decisions are made because of what we think the impacts will be on flourishing, rather than the impacts on GDP. GDP is easier to measure, but it's not the thing that matters. And I think flourishing is what matters. So that means we're in massively fuzzier territory, but I, have nothing but respect and gratitude for all of the collaborators involved in the program in trying to make incremental progress towards how do we make evidence-based claims about what interventions actually lead to better lives for people, and how much can we improve people's lives at all, or are they fairly fixed, and all kinds of questions that come out of it. So that's one thing. The other is if you look at the paper, some of the examples that he gives and that he critiques when he drops down into actual material from his fields, it's hilarious. It's questions. It's like the things that some of these scales are asking people in self-report are I've been pretty successful in life on Snyder's Hope Scale, or taking pride in your achievements in the Connor Davidson Resilience Scale. So these are super fuzzy, soft concepts. And I think he's trying to he's trying to be absurdly formal and rigorous to try to make the kinds of assessments that are in his field as rigorous as possible, which I also think is a great thing, despite the difficulty, or because of the difficulty, really. It's and then the thing that you brought up, Xavier, I think there's the third thing is giving powerful tools for people to make arguments about reminding people or critiquing people's causal stories. Like I also expect we're entering a world. I mean, we see this, like our the people with the most influence in politics these days, I think, are very, very, very willing to be very confident about simple stories that they're telling about what actions they're taking and the positive outcomes that it's having. And the more that gets integrated into like, yeah, machine decision-making systems, the more having very formal tools for showing no, you can't make that causal claim, that story doesn't hold, and adding that into the conversation for scientists and engineers building this stuff is helpful. So I would be sad if we took from this paper something like throwing up our hands or something, rather than noticing, like looking for ways that he's offering us tools to actually improve the richness and depth of the science and engineering work that we can do, and the policy work that we can do.
Yeah, and I think building on that, like converse to throwing up our hands and saying this isn't good, actually understanding that the model is a tool to achieve something can maybe encourage you to be more bold in the construct of that model in itself to achieve those aims, and that's okay. Instead of trying to find a model that represents absolute truth, but doesn't achieve your objectives, actually.
Yeah, that's a fascinating provocation. Zainab, did you have I noticed your hand up a couple times. Did you have a?
Yeah, I can say a few things. I actually really like the paper. I thought seeing it visually, space-time and concepts is really useful. I think even if the only thing that the paper accomplishes is being very, very humble about how we reason, make causal claims, even in our everyday lives at work, with our relationships, I think it's great. Do I think there's like some kind of hidden univariate? Probably, maybe, because I think there are ways of tying physics to policies by the free energy principle, something that Carl Friston and I think Michael Levin also kind of works on. My background is in econometrics, where we did causal. I did my master's thesis, like causal work based on difference and difference, which is to look at natural experiments in the world where everything was the same, and then something happened, and a natural experiment took place, and then that's the only way you can do a causal thing. So if this thing didn't exist, what happens? And to make it intuitive, this is like A/B testing, right? And when you do A/B testing, you can at least operationally make sense of like your causes. I think the other last thing is, I think this paper especially just reminds me how much of it is on us to take our feelings and intuitions and to articulate it into reason for others. And as you know, the more we put the onus on ourselves, the more there's like common consensus and policy and protocols. So those are my 2 cents.
Okay, thank you. There was one thing I wanted to, in terms of something concrete, I almost wish he'd given examples when he was saying that we needed to formalize our construct and concepts, because I noticed like, if the whole story is that like be cautious of your formalizations, I was a little bit confused by his suggestion that maybe one path. I could see formalizing them as an exercise to just point out that you have some idea of, say, what flourishing is or what intelligence is anyway, to really like just encourage people to like put a kind of discussion of that in. But I really would have wanted, I find myself curious to know what he means by that. And I would have loved a couple concrete examples in some of his fields of what a good formalization of a construct or concept would be or would look like. And actually, I'm just riffing with thoughts. I put it in the comment in the chat, but I think again to like, why does this matter? Because I often, I take what Jen's saying very seriously, and I certainly as an individual, I've seen individuals I know start to do, I would argue, too much of their individual decision making on the basis of formal models, where they would be better suited to like check their intuitions. They try to have like a checklist of what they're looking for in a lover, and then they're forever alone because they can't just meet the person that's sitting across the table from them. They're checking them against some, referent. I see this, people get really into developmental models as well, where they're constantly trying to figure out if the person across from them is a level 5 or a level 6.8 instead of just talking to them. That said, institutions, which I think we critique institutions, but it's very hard for, a hospital to make a policy about, how long the shifts the nurses have with the patients is at the level of just like vibing their intuition of it in moment to moment, right? And so, but that, you might want, when they're doing that decision, they might, given nothing else, they might use, the economic metric and be like, how much does it cost us if we put the shifts this long versus the shifts this long, or how many errors do the nurses make? How to make the shifts as long as possible with as few errors as possible, which might be a reasonable starting point. But you might want them to somehow be able to survey the well-being of the patients in such a way that they can eventually bubble up some sort of an insight that allows them to make that staffing decision. Just as a very, I know some folks who work in hospital systems. It's not that they as individuals don't have a ton of intuition and heart and want to operate in that way, but just like, how do we, given all that intuition and heart, make a grounded policy decision here? And that decision is going to look like, what's the maximum shift length for a nurse? So that's somewhere I feel like if I read this with my hospital CEO hat on, I'm not a hospital CEO, but if I was, I would read it with very differently than if I'm reading this as how do I, Xavier, operate in my day-to-day with like kind of basic human life interactions.
Yeah, to me, this is...
I have
Yeah, go ahead.
I have a curiosity here, and I don't know enough about AI perhaps, but it seems to me we already have a tool that's extraordinarily capable linguistically to draw out, say we had Xavier's hospital example, say we had the hospital forum and the nurses are sharing their issues and problems, or the people who are coming in, and we have an AI that can draw very good conclusion from the large amount of group speak. We've got the very horrible examples of Cambridge Analytica that use Facebook and what have you to be extraordinarily abusively managing the way people are thinking and talking to each other. So I would think, Xavier, you're talking about the metrics and academia speak. I would have thought that an AI, rather than asking people 5 or 6 very simple questions, that perhaps we can develop a linguistic manner of looking at conversations which an AI can pass through. The trouble is AI is a little bit of a black box, but that would give us some insights onto thriving and flourishing and how people felt each individually, but also an en masse thing.
A friend of mine is actually working on that. Eric, he gave a presentation at the conference as well. It's one of the projects. So I think there is promise in that direction of like survey plus plus sort of thing, where it's not a fixed survey, but it's a conversation with a large language model bot, where the large language model actually follows you down the rabbit holes of your individual self to come up with a quantitative measured outcome about you, but not based on 7 questions, but based on individualized path. Yeah. I don't know if Xavier, you wanted to answer that or...
No, just yeah, I mean, just kind of what I wrote here, that there's a bit of a danger of like, you could almost say like language washing, making it seem like a lot of nuance went into it, because AI is, if nothing else, really good at writing a paragraph which seems coherent, arguing for why something sounds like a good policy. And so my question, if again, here I am, hospital CEO, fine, I've gone and done a bunch of natural language surveys of my nurses, got ChatGPT to look at them, and now it's written, I think a good policy intervention would be to make the shifts 4 hours long. Then how, it's in the end, just taking that text and doing a bunch of matrix multiplies on it, and then popping out a coherent looking sentence, which may or may not be a good outcome. And so then I'd have this question of like, okay, do I think that's working well? And then I'd have this question, if I was in that position, I'd be like, let's try that intervention. Now, what am I measuring to see if it works? The answer could be, I asked ChatGPT again afterwards, And now it gives me another coherent sentence saying whether I did a better job or not. But I'm not completely satisfied with that. So that would be my caution. That said, I mean, I love the idea of moving away from like a 4 survey question to a more nuanced. Like I do think using AI to somehow extract more richness from a survey is totally reasonable. I don't think it removes the metrics question. Yeah, incidentally, anytime I've done a survey, anytime you're filling one in, it's so obvious what a bad tool surveys are. Anytime I'm filling in like, how did you enjoy this class? And like, that's a very complicated question that you're asking me. And you've got like a scale from 1 to 10 here. Like, I don't know how to begin to, and I've never once not had that experience filling out a survey. So definitely some alignment.
Yeah, what I wanted to say earlier is to me this question of, where do we do metrics and causal and where do we do this nuance seeing the person in front of you is really a question of coordination, right? That ultimately we're trying to coordinate a society, a globalized society of whatever 8 billion people, right? And there are levels, there's this, right? Like, and it almost seems like, okay, well, on the highest level, the coordination's happening via single number metric, which we call money, right? And maybe other metrics as well. But right, there is this, if you're trying to signal to billions of people, you can't give nuance. Like same as why, the politicians that are successful give confident stories, right? Of being like, look, more money equals good, right? So this is almost like if you're trying to coordinate a lot of people, you need very simple, very effective communication channels where you just give a number, everybody hears it, everybody understands what a number is, right? On a nuance like one-on-one level, you can have all kinds of like authentic relating, sharing about emotions and experience in the moment. It's a very different experience, right? On a group level, if you're trying to coordinate 10 people, you can have some conversation, but you also can't fully go into everybody's personal experience. Otherwise, you have eternal meetings, right? As we all know. And now you're trying to coordinate at the same time across levels. You have your personal relationships, you have your small group dynamics, you have your larger extended community, and you have the global economy you're participating in. How do you coordinate on all these levels in a way, right? So the nuance of language is great, but it doesn't scale. So we can't use it to scale billions of people. That's why we use these metrics on large scales, right? Metrics have their problems, and right. So that I don't know. To me, this is sort of a question, and talking about these causal univariate, right, factors, um, and some formal but more richer, right? I feel like we need to be aware of these trade-offs and come up with systems that are, yeah.
Zainab, I'm going to let you hop in. I just want to say we've got just a couple minutes left. I don't have to hop off right away, so I'm happy to leave the call open. But I maybe encourage folks, especially for folks who have to leave, to kind of any final words, any sort of checking out thoughts, and we'll do that. And then anybody who's can stick around, I'm happy to stick around for a little bit after the call. So yeah, feel free if anyone hop in if you feel like you haven't spoken or there's something burning a hole in your soul that you want to get out. Now's the time.
Yeah, okay. I want to ask Zach if he'd be willing to look at our survey dependent variables and independent variables and path model. And I could ask an AI, but I want to know if we are doing what the author is suggesting already, or if there is something you can prove given the lessons of this paper. Interested in that, or is that too much to ask? Or anybody else, actually?
You were breaking up a fair bit, Yuval. I'm not sure. It sounds like you wanted to talk about something. Maybe
Damn it.
I would read something.
Yeah. I was wondering if Zach, can I try again? I'm moving to a different part of this house. If Zach or anybody else is interested in looking at our survey, and seeing if we're already applying the lessons of this paper, or if we could improve based on the lessons of this paper.
Yeah,
It's a very
Yuval,
applied kind of.
Yuval, I'm sending a follow-up email after the call, and I'll include your email address. I'm BCCing folks now just to keep it from being too noisy on email, but I'll include your email address in that, and that way people can reach out directly with that ask. Does that work? And you've got
Were
Zach's
you
put
able to hear what I said?
Yeah, we heard you, Yuval. Zach's got his email in the thread, and I'll also put your email
Okay.
in the follow-up so that everybody's in touch.
Great, thanks.
Any other closing thoughts?
One thing that is coming to mind for me is even if we are able to design, let's say, better variables for measuring the outcomes that we desire, what kind of institutional inertia and incentives might be preventing it? Let's say ending homelessness, if it requires interventions across education and unemployment agencies and also construction, but they are specifically siloed jobs, and so the government might just not be designed to function in that way. People might not be willing to collaborate across these domains as well. So maybe it's not just a problem of information, but it stretches beyond to institution and incentive design as well. So, like applying the lessons from this paper would also require us to look at the whole territory and not just the map of metric design.
Okay, well, I just want to thank everyone. I think that was a really, for me, a nourishing conversation. So I just want to thank Zach for doing a great presentation and picking a really interesting paper. I want to thank everyone else for participating, and Pavel for the CSCSC community, which has been great to have here. And with that, I mean, we're kind of done. I know. Okay, we lost her. We lost Ineb, so I know she had some final thoughts. But I'm happy to, again, I'll keep the call open for a couple of moments. I might stop the recording now, but if people need to take off, thank you so much for coming. And on the 22nd, in 2 weeks, we'll have the next meeting. It'll be quite a different flavor. It'll be more continental philosophy. J.F. Martel will be presenting some of Quentin Missayou's writings on hyperchaos, a world of no causality. If you don't know J.F. Martel's work, he's really involved in, he runs the Weird Studies podcast and the Weirdology, I think, school. And there's this like very unsettling kind of goth mystery philosophy vibe to his work, which I find really compelling and a great counterpoint to these clear pictures. Yeah, see you all in a couple of weeks.
I wanted to ask